Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro Mabasso. I will be your moderator for this panel. This panel called Decolonising Drug Policy, American Exceptionalism, and Why the Role of the US in Global Drug Policy Must Change. I'm very excited to be moderating such a marvelous panel, such an important topic as part of Constellation's program. I will be introducing each of our panelists and giving them something like 14 minutes to speak each, so that we can have some minutes for questions and answers at the end of the presentations. So let us begin, and let me just make a brief introduction of why we think this panel is important, and some of the things that you can maybe be hearing in the next few minutes. So American exceptionalism and why the role of the US in global drug policy must change. So let me use phrases that may not be as politically amiable or as established as American exceptionalism and substitute them by a caricature. And that caricature is that the US is simultaneously, and it's not too far-fetched as a caricature, the US is simultaneously imperial and parochial. And that may be said of many different areas, but it certainly is true, I believe, of the US's role in drug policy, in world drug policy. The US is parochial because it understands drug policy and the problems related to both the use and illicit traffic of drugs very much from their own perspective, from a very local perspective, and very unaware of what the dynamics in other countries are playing out, and how that is affecting other countries, how prohibition is affecting other countries. It is at the same time imperial because the US leads in many ways both prohibition, the US government leads worldwide prohibition in many different areas, but also subnational governments in the US and civil society in the US have also led the fight for drug policy reform in several areas. So what the US does matters to the rest of the world, but I'm not quite sure what actually happens in the rest of the world matters to the US much. And that's what we want to bring to the table here, and we want to question the role of the US and how that is playing out. Let's begin this panel with one excellent panelist that I'm sure that we will all enjoy, but has a very difficult task because I'm going to front load deep questioning for her. She is Nazli Masoudi. She is manager of policy impact at the Center for Drug Policy Evaluation in Canada. She's also a PhD candidate in health service research at the University of Toronto. And I must say, I think she is one of the acute minds working on the international, the global, the multilateral arena today in drug policy. And so I'm going to push her. I'm going to push her hard, I hope. And I'm going to begin by asking her, why should drug policy reform efforts care about what happens in the UN? The UN, in my opinion, is way too slow to move along the drug policy reform lines. The trees are not going to move anywhere, at least that's my impression. And from my own very parochial perspective, what I've always said is, what should we do with the UN or the treaties stemming from the UN? Well, we should violate them and go ahead with drug policy reform. So the first question is, why should we care about the UN when the UN doesn't seem to care that much about the problems caused by prohibition worldwide, and it doesn't seem to be agile enough to respond?
Thanks so much, Alejandro. And I'll start just by saying thank you to the organizers of this panel as well. It's such a privilege and pleasure to be here and be able to talk about this really important topic. And Alejandro, your question, I think, is one that many people have. There is a lot of pessimism or lack of certainty around the value, thinking about our limited capacity. People that are working in this sector already have so many different forums and mechanisms that advocacy engagement is warranted. There is a very reasonable question, why bother going to the United Nations and engaging in the international drug control regime? So I, as somebody who kind of started my work in drug policy in the UN system and has continued to do that work for 8 years, I do have a number of reasons that I think it's important, and I'm happy to share those, and I hope some of them resonate with folks. So firstly, I think you're absolutely right, Alejandro, that the pace at which change happens at the international level is very slow. It's glacial in a lot of ways. And this has to do a lot with the reality that the international drug control system, it happens by consensus. So we have member states on one end of the spectrum who have regulated cannabis for non-medical markets or for recreational adult use, whatever you want to call it. And then on the other side, we have states that are still using the death penalty for cannabis offenses. So given that drugs is a global issue, member states come together to discuss the global direction for drug policy, and they need to agree. Unlike other areas in the UN where they'll vote, in this sector, everything is by consensus. So you can imagine that it's particularly glacial because all the divergent perspectives need to agree on the direction forward. I think of global drug policy as kind of the box, the parameters internationally around what's permitted, what's seen as acceptable for drug policy approaches. So while it's true that the pace is slow, there are certainly incremental gains that happen at every session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, where member states meet to discuss drug policy issues. And that incremental kind of progress does create space for member states to take more progressive positions that maybe they would not have or been able to do given their own kind of power when it comes to international relations until something was perceived as more acceptable. Now, Alejandro, going to your second point about the need to maybe disregard these conventions or step outside these conventions because they are not achieving their own objectives for sure, but they're also causing a plethora of other harms. And I would completely agree with that as well. I think like Canada has done, like Uruguay has done, like the US at the state level has done, absolutely stepping outside the conventions to do something like regulate recreational cannabis markets is critical to moving our system ahead. But what becomes really important is after member states do that in their own jurisdictions, how do they come back to the international stage and actually use that to advance that system? Because it's very common in international law, in treaty systems, for there to be periods of non-compliance member states. But what ends up being really useful is when that is taken as an opportunity to modernize the treaty system and to come together and update the pieces that need to be updated in recognition that the non-compliance positions are valid and are based on, you know, things like the overarching objectives that were initially put forward in these treaties. So we can talk maybe during the Q&A if people are interested in the different ways that Uruguay and the US and Canada have justified that and the extent to which I think that's helpful on the international stage. But I think, yes, even if you work within box, or if you step outside the box, there is this kind of imperative to come to the international stage and engage in multilateralism on this global issue in order to help the treaty system move forward and allow other member states who may not be in the same power positions in international relations, like someone like the United States, to be able to do that which they previously did not feel they could do when it comes to progressive drug policies. So those are a couple reasons. I'll share a couple more. One is certainly changing the global paradigm by bringing your domestic reforms there. So it is kind of like the piece about how are you going to justify your violations about cannabis reform, but it's also things like advancements that happen in your country, making sure that at the international stage, those are well known. Specifically, I'm thinking about at the most recent meeting on drugs that happened in April. It was the first since the Biden-Harris priorities were announced, which of course include harm reduction. And the US, Regina Labelle, stood up in the general debate and very explicitly expressed US support for harm reduction. And those two words, I should say, are very contentious in this forum. In fact, those two words have never appeared next to each other in any documentation that's come out of the international drug control regime. So for the US, a very influential member state in this space, and one who has historically not been supportive of harm reduction, for them to go and be explicitly supportive, that carries a lot of weight. And that can have kind of the same ramifications of what I was saying about opening up space for other member states to be more supportive of harm reduction, know that the US is in their corner on this issue and that they have a stronger contingent, even pushing UN agencies that are funded by the US to take a more progressive or supportive position around harm reduction because of that explicit endorsement now. And with respect to UN agencies too, I'll add here that there is a piece as well about holding UN agencies accountable. Certainly we're there engaging with member states, but there is also engagement with UN agencies. And one example here I'll give is that sometimes it's not well known, but the dual purposes of the international drug control regime are, yes, to prevent the supply and demand of drugs for recreational or illicit purposes, suppress demand and supply, but equally important is to ensure those medicines are available for scientific and medical purposes, right? And that goal is completely sidelined by the prohibitionist, the kind of punitive approaches. So it's on us to kind of make sure that the dual objectives, the system-wide coherence all around the UN, that we're not undermining human rights, that we're making sure that other UN agencies outside of just the UN Office on Drugs and Crime are intervening here. And maybe just the very last reason I'll give for why it's really worth being here, maybe this one resonates the most. If we, as drug policy reform, are not there, and specifically US drug policy reform, you can bet that the prevention, the drug-free world, US civil society groups are there, and they're there in droves. So it's this idea of what is the message that's coming from civil society and who is there to support progressive member states, right? If there's a large civil society contingent that's supporting progressive member states and trying to push them to take better positions, that's going to go a longer way than if the only voices in the room from civil society are drug-free world folks or prevention-minded folks. So I think, yeah, certainly wanting to make sure that our voice is heard in these forums is really important.
Okay, so I agree with that, but let me push back anyway. So I hear you saying that the UN is valuable because in some way, in spite of what many of us who are not as focused and in tune with the multilateral system may believe from our own countries, the UN can be used as leverage for change. Would you agree with that phrasing? Okay. Yes. So, but it being used as leverage from change for change depends on two things I heard you say. One is that governments that do walk out come back in and try to push change at the international level for other countries to benefit from. Kind of like, let's imagine the cavern with Plato, and people walk out of the cavern, they have to come back and tell the others that, these are shadows, right? But if governments don't do that, then they're not really using the UN as leverage. And at least the US doesn't seem to be doing that. Yeah. We have a saying in Mexico that says, you can be a light on the street, but darkness in your house. Here it's the other way around. I think the US is in many ways light in its house in some areas, but very dark in the outside, US government at least in accepting prohibition. So here's a role for civil society. And you say the US civil society is there in droves, but I've often heard activists from other countries complain that the US activism is mostly done domestically and not enough is done in the international arena, at least not enough to be a counterweight to the US government, which still pushes hard for prohibition. So what is the role for American NGOs in the international arena if they are to use the UN as leverage and not just as leverage for prohibition?
Thanks, Alejandro. Yeah, just to make sure that I'm clear, I think you're absolutely right that US civil society from the reform side of the drug policy movement has been there in lower numbers than maybe other countries. Certainly there are a few, and I don't want to erase groups like WOLA, SSDP, certainly veterans that work on medical cannabis, even DPA and Harm Reduction Coalition did have some engagement previously, but that's kind of been deprioritized. So it is unfortunately more so the prevention and drug-free world US civil society that is there and what needs to be balanced. But I think you're right. There's this piece around holding your government accountable, about making sure that what they're saying in these forums is in alignment with what they're doing at home. And if there's a disconcordance there, holding them accountable and pointing to that and doing advocacy around that as well. And then also that what they're saying at just both directions, right? What they're doing at home is what they're saying at the international stage. And then what they're saying at the international stage, they're actually bringing at home, because there is often a disconnect. But I find that disconnect can allow for advocacy opportunities and opportunities to hold governments accountable. But it's only possible when civil society is monitoring what their government is saying, not only at home, but also internationally. Because of course, that's the image they're putting out into the world. And there are many opportunities where they're misaligned, and civil society can encourage better concordance between that in the direction of positive progressive reform.
So we have a few minutes left. I really want to squeeze you for all the information that you may have. So let me still push forth. In your opinion, what would be some kind of like acupuncture points in which U.S. civil society should be and could be pushing at in the multilateral system to enact change, not only for the U.S. to be congruent inside and outside, but also to actually do the work of monitoring the atrocities that are made in the name of prohibition by other countries with American support?
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to share maybe a few kind of practical mechanics of like what can you actually do in this forum to have some impact, to have some influence. And my examples come from what we've been able to do with Canada, but also more broadly in those forums. So I think one example I will give is that in Canada, we have a working group of civil society across the country that works on UN drug policy related issues. And this working group meets very regularly with our Canadian government colleagues, both before, during, and after these regular meetings around drugs, but also now in a year-round process. Because as much as I focused on the International Drug Control Regime or the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, drugs come up in other parts of the UN too. And it's worth being aware of those for all the same reasons we've talked about, for leverage, for using them as advocacy tools, things like that. So I think being involved in this forum is another kind of hook, another leverage point for more sustained engagement with your government. And what that can lead to as well, I know for us in Canada, every year we prepare a policy brief for Canada, and we indicate to them what we would like to see them highlight in their statements, in their votes, and the way that they engage with other member states at these meetings. And in fact, we also publish that, to your point, Alejandro, about not only being for our own member state or where we're based, we also produce that as what's called an NGO paper that becomes an official UN documentation that's distributed to all member states. So the same types of priorities we would like Canada to take up can also be disseminated to other member states. Of course, we've also been able to give Canada input on things like their statements and their positions, and actually give them some track changes around draft documentation that they intend to share with other member states. And really, because of the constructive ongoing relationship, we've seen them actually take up our feedback and revise the statements they intend to make based on that. So I think it's really, really useful for like building your relationship with your member state by having this other forum to engage in and be knowledgeable on. And often you will end up being more knowledgeable about it because there's so much turnover and so much change in terms of the government colleagues that are working on these files, that civil society sometimes has been in the space for much longer. So it's quite useful for them to learn from you. And then maybe just a couple other practical ways of getting engaged that are not specific to a member state is, of course, side events. These are official proceedings of this annual Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting, where individuals, civil society can organize side events on often more controversial topics that won't be covered in the larger meetings. And you can present at those, you can attend those. And then there's also the opportunity for civil society to make statements actually at the UN in the plenary to all member states. You can share your research, you can share your priorities, the knowledge and expertise you have based on your experiential work. And that's often something that's selected through the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs for speakers applicants apply to through them, and then speakers are selected. So really there is a wide variety of ways. There's also, things like sharing information online. That transparency is not great when it comes to the International Drug Control Regime. So even just using it as a way to make sure knowledge about what's happening there reaches outside the UN walls is also important. I think those are the key mechanisms that come to mind.
Perfect, Leslie. That's a lot of food for thought. Some of us might even regain faith. But I think very importantly, you've also set out a list of to-dos for American NGOs working that still have faith in the international system. And I think that's very important. So thank you very much, Leslie. I will now move on to our next panelist. We have with us Isabel Pereira. She's research coordinator on drug policy for De Justicia in Colombia. She's also a member of the Colectivo de Estudios de Drogas y Derecho, the Collective for Study of Drugs and Law. That is a network of research teams doing simultaneous work throughout Latin America. She is, and I must say this, a key figure in a key institution. De Justicia is maybe one of the most prestigious and relevant NGOs in all of Latin America. And they're working out from Colombia. So I want to ask Isabel, I don't want her to limit herself to Colombia, but to speak from the experience of Colombia. DPA has, over the last few years, switched its hashtag, so to speak, which actually points to, I think, a deep reorientation in the way they look at drug policy, from asking governments to legalize it to having the right at the end of legalize it right. And legalizing it right means that there's actually investment in the regulation, in the context of that legalization. So regulation is important in drug policy reform. It's not only about moving away from prohibition, but moving into a better regulatory system than prohibition. And so I want to ask you, what does right mean here? What do we need to think about in countries, particularly countries that have been devastated by prohibitions, such as Colombia or Mexico? What makes it right? What makes legalization right? Because not all legalization, I think, can be called right, maybe. And so could you please speak to that?
For sure. Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you to Cassandra, DPA, and all the team that's working behind the scenes here in Constellations. I'm happy to be here. So when Alejandro asked me about this question about what it means to legalize it right, the first thing that comes to mind is that we haven't taken the time to figure out what can we learn from the experiences that have already been made in terms of legalization. So one first point in the agenda for the movement itself is how we document what is happening in the regulation of medicinal cannabis markets. And that speaks specifically to the role of Canada, for example, but also to the role of the US. And what has it meant for local farmers who are growing these plants in the region? Has their lives been made better? Have they been made worse? Or has it just not changed at all? And I think as the movement goes on and on about legalizing it right in the US and in other fora, there's not a lot of conversation on how do we learn from these transnational relationships that are happening because of medicinal cannabis regulations that is really not working out in the best of ways for people in the so-called global south. So one first, just like an opener, is just to think of that. But also when I think about regulation, because here I'd like to make a point that in the Colombian context, we don't necessarily speak of legalization because it's not just sufficient to speak of eliminating the penal consequences of drug activities, but generating a regulatory framework for the substances and those markets and the people who use them. So we generally don't speak of legalization, we speak of regulation. So when we speak of regulation, we also tend to be very wary of how we set expectations. Of course, being from Colombia and from the Andean region, one first thing that has to happen when we talk about regulating it right should be to speak of other substances and of all substances. Marijuana is basically a mainstream conversation, more or less. So far this year in Colombia, there have been like 2 or 3 bills presented to Congress for regulating adult use of cannabis. So that's more of a calm conversation. It happens in mainstream media more often, and public opinion is more used to the conversation on marijuana because they're seeing the process abroad and leaders are changing and so on and so forth. But this conversation, when we shift it to cocaine, it's a whole different scenario in which people are not very much comfortable of having the conversation about cocaine regulation, and much less so heroin. But I'm going to speak of cocaine regulation because it's the substance that is more prevalent here in Colombia. And what I meant when speaking about expectation setting is that every so often, both from the reform movement here and the reform movement in the US and at the UN level, there is this idea of like regulation will bring peace, regulation will bring stability to the region. Regulation is the key, the key that we have to open a door of peace and the promise of peace in Colombia and in the Andean region. But I'm very weary, and we are very weary of that idea. I think regulation does have the potential, regulation of cocaine, I mean, does have the potential to reduce the power of certain criminal organizations in certain regions. But let's not forget that criminal organizations and organized crime profit from many different activities, not only the drug trade. And this is true for Colombia, this is true for the whole of Central America, this is true for Mexico, this is true even for the criminal networks in the US that receive our shipments. So when we speak of how to reduce the violence, which is something that is very important to the Latin American region, regulation will not be that only key. So it will be important when we think about legalizing it right or regulating it right, to really set expectations where they need to be. We can't promise that regulation will bring full implementation of the peace agreement, but also, and this is like the flip side of my argument, there is no hope for the peace agreement unless there is cocaine regulation. And that is sort of the paradox where we stand in Colombia right now. The peace agreement, I'll make a parenthesis here because as Alejandro was saying, the US tend to lead very parochial, and maybe some of you don't know this, but in 2016, it's going to be 5 years now, Colombia signed a peace agreement with the longest standing guerrilla group in the Americas called FARC, and one of the chapters in that peace agreement is called The Solution to the Illicit Drug Problem. Which is very paradoxical because there is no solution unless we regulate, and regulation is not part of the promises of that peace agreement. This long-winded explanation is just to say that the paradox where we stand in producing countries is that we need to really set expectations very at a reasonable level of what regulation can bring to economies and also to social and security concerns in a region. But the other side is that unless we move forward with regulation, security and situations regarding organized crime are only going to get worse. Then when we think about legalizing it right and regulating it right for the Colombian case and for producing countries, we also need to remember what the legacy of US-led foreign policy has been in Colombia and in the Americas. So even though there's this recent shift with the Biden administration, the US government and its policy toward Latin America continues to promote, through the Inter-American system, for example, drug courts in many countries. This has happened in Mexico, this has happened in Ecuador, this has happened in other countries in the region. So while at the domestic level, US civil society is advocating for drug courts not to be the mechanism through which the US system responds to drug use, at the foreign level, they continue to export this model. And there is a disconnect with how that advocacy plays out in the international scheme. But also the role and the legacy of US-led foreign policy in Colombia in particular is a legacy of how its resources towards Pan-Colombia and the military strategy allowed for the escalation of conflict, allowed for the escalation of victims, and for the escalation of many serious human rights violations that to date have not had accountability. And how will regulation deal with that past is something that still baffles me a lot.
So, Isabel, let me interrupt you here and jump in and push you a little bit on two different directions. I hear you speaking of the devastation that prohibition has caused and how that has to be taken into consideration. So I wonder here if what we need to think of is in tiered processes of reform and regulation. We can think of a whole structure of a regulated market for cocaine. But to get there, we probably need to think of how to get there and how to regulate the transition there. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that you're saying we need to think this as a process and regulate it as a process, and that may mean differentiated regulations a long time. But
Alejandro,
then I also hear you saying...
I missed you for a bit. Can you go back like half a minute? I missed the question.
Sure. What I hear you saying there is that we need to do differentiated regulation through time. We need to regulate a process of weaning ourselves from prohibition and into regulation. But I also hear you complaining about somewhat Trump solutions, Trump card solutions like drug courts. Oh, let's support drug courts. I mean, part of the problem is thinking that one model is applicable everywhere, and that's a problem of prohibition itself. It's a one size fits all solution, also of drug courts, and therefore I want to ask: are you saying that what we need to do is to regulate not only substances differently, but also different substances should probably be regulated differently in different countries? And how would that look? And let me throw it back at the international arena when we're discussing a global system. Does a global system need to make way for all this diversification at the national level and at the different substance level and at different times countries need to move into regulation? And can the international system participate in that, or does that have to be a homegrown process for each?
Well, this is a question for about like a full panel, and it's very complicated. I'm going to start with the last one. So definitely there should be a different model for regulating different substances. And in the case of cocaine, that leads us to the international arena, not necessarily the UN. That is a formula that I think we as a movement haven't thought through enough. And that is just a question that I give back to everyone who's listening. Does the regulation of cocaine need to go through some sort of international mechanism? Because Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia need to sell their cocaine to someone. Like, we are not very much users of cocaine. I was just looking at the figures yesterday, and the prevalence of cocaine use in the past year in Colombia, the whole of the population was 3%. And we export like tons and tons. So there's no way, even if we regulate domestically, what are we going to do with all that produce? And who are we going to sell it to, and through which mechanisms? And I think we as a movement, and that goes back to the role of the US and the role also of the people who go to the UN level, is what kind of questions are we asking about the models we need for regulating these type of substances, depending on their processes themselves. It's very different to regulate marijuana, which is a plant that you can grow basically anywhere, and that doesn't need that much transformation. But cocaine necessarily needs to be grown in certain places and then needs to be transformed. It's not sold as raw material. So those are the kind of questions that we need to start asking more. And it's not a question that producer countries can answer on their own, because, again, we need to sell to someone. We need a market. And then about the model, that and that kind of trump cards that the US exports very much so often. So one of them is drug courts. The other one is the mechanism of decertification, decertifying certain countries for not complying with their counter narcotics and anti-drug fights. That is just a measure that goes against even the international treaties when we think about sovereignty and when we think about the spirit of collaboration, but respecting sovereignty of other countries. And that has been trumped, might I use that word, very so often within the drug policy space. And also the issue, and this directs back to something Nasli was mentioning about the incremental and small, very small changes. At the UN level, there has been a push from civil society from very many years ago about the need to change the metrics by which we measure success. It makes no point whatsoever to continue to measure our success and the US success in the drug policy fight to just say whether or not hectares of coca have gone down or up from a year to another year. It makes no sense when we think about the fact that 200,000 families depend solely on that crop. And wherever that crop is eradicated, the whole economy of that town disappears. And those are populations that are already at a higher poverty rate than all the other rural populations in Colombia. So when we measure success by saying, oh, coca went up and coca went down every so year and often, that's not telling us anything about whether or not the conditions in which people live, which is what should matter to us, are changing or not. And the incremental change that happened this year is that the new Biden-Harris counter-narcotics strategy towards Colombia specifically states the need to change the metrics. So you can see how it trickles down, if it's even so small, but it trickles down from the UN level, where the reform movement has advocated for the change in metrics. And now, finally, after 30 years of placing the money in the wrong place, the US might at least want to look into socioeconomic indicators when measuring their success or not in their drug policy, quote unquote, fight.
Isabel, thank you for that response. I'm going to pick up one idea and emphasize it and underscore it before I move on to our next panelist. But I think that what you said just a second ago, in that success should be measured by how it affects or how it betters the way people live. I think that that is crucial. That is something that we need to take into consideration, not only for producers, but also for users and for everybody involved. And we need to understand how people live, how people relate to drugs in order to measure if we're doing a good job at making people have better lives. I think that was a very powerful insight, precisely for regulation, because regulation models have to be evaluated, and maybe we need to rethink the core objectives of regulation from the very beginning. And I think that quality of life of people, thank you for that. I'm taking that with me. Let me now move on to Smriti Rana. Smriti Rana is policy. She's in charge of policy and community engagement at Palyu, India, in India. And I will ask her to speak on what I believe is a paradox, a tension, or I want to ask her, is there a tension or is there convergence between the claims that seem to be contradictory, that there isn't enough access to opioids in most of the world, and there is too much access, too easy access to opioids in the United States? And I want to link this to American parochialism, because it seems now, I mean, finally, after many years of an opioid crisis in the US, I think there's some responsibility being taken about what the role of the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, has been in this. And a lot points to too lax a regulation. But then on the other hand, we have too strict a regulation in most of the world to actually give access to people who need the medicine. So please speak about this tension. Tell us a little bit, illustrate please a little bit about what it looks like from the other side, from when you can't access medication and what the problems are there.
Thank you, Alejandro. And thank you all for inviting me. So my perspective is, like Alejandro said, of the palliative care community and our challenges with access to essential medicines, especially opioids for pain relief. And there's no, underestimating the influence and the impact of the American narrative on the rest of the world. But before I get into that, I think it's important to state that history actually predates the US involvement, and it goes back to the opium trade in the Southeast Asian region, specifically between India and China, that was orchestrated by the East India Company, which was pretty much what fueled empire. And they traded it in spite of knowing its dangers and for over a century. And this trade actually pretty much shapes what we now experience as a cartography of pain. And today the biggest pain burden lies with countries that were erstwhile colonies. And so colonialism seen, I suppose, in the way of these building waves. And what do I mean by that is the first, of course, was the formal colonization, and then we got independence, so to speak. But then being independent doesn't free us from the mindset and the spirit of colonization. So what we experience now is neo-colonialism expressing itself in multiple ways. Now, let's talk about policy, for instance, and current regulations that are imposed across the world have a Western lens to them. They were made through the lens of a colonizer with absolutely no regard or consultation with low and middle income countries, and also with no regard for traditional and cultural uses, which I think other speakers will elucidate on later, but rather framed on this idea of licensing and prescription and control. Now, this kind of regulation might work for Western countries and for the US because these countries are strengthened by bodies like the FDA. They are well equipped with healthcare facilities and resources, infrastructure as well as personnel. But that's not the case in a low and middle income country. Just the presence of a policy does not guarantee that it will be implemented. And we in India have seen that firsthand. We have a ringside view to it. I can talk about that in a minute. But there's the other aspect to it where decisions that directly impact low and middle income countries are still made in the global north and in Geneva and Vienna, which pretty much remain out of reach to those whom these decisions impact the most. And most countries don't have diplomatic links there. Now, what does this translate into? It's the saying that if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And that's what's been happening to us a lot. So I would just like to share a map, if I may, for a couple of seconds. What you're seeing here is, the global map of how opioids are consumed, and it's proportionate to the consumption. And you can see that entire countries just disappear off this map, whereas you have this, this disproportionately large consumption happening in North America and Western Europe and in the global North countries. Thank you very much for that. So this brings me to the single convention, which in principle is not burdensome because it very clearly lays out, the principle of balance, which is a dual responsibility to not just prevent misuse and diversion, but also to make, you know, narcotics available, narcotics and psychotropics available for medical and scientific purposes. But the reality is grossly off balance in favor of enforcement, as we all know. Now, in this age of harsh enforcement, what this leads to is an imposition of this very American idea of, you know, the vilification of substances without any regard for this principle of balance. Now, I want to talk about my country, India, specifically as a case study here. For us, this led to to a very draconian law, which is the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. And this is a law that doesn't adequately differentiate between, you know, supplier, consumer, and even within consumers, the different categories. And what this law did when it came into effect in 1985, it resulted in a massive drop in the consumption of opioid analgesics, which is actually a proxy indicator for palliative care services in any country. And sometime in the 90s, the national consumption of morphine actually fell to about 37 kilograms in a country as vast as India. And what does that mean for the consumption to drop that much? That the pain burden exponentially increases that much. And so because of all the harsh, extremely harsh punitive measures, even for minor clerical errors, this also led to an attitude of fear and opiophobia. And this led to a whole, you know, a whole bunch of generations of doctors not being trained in it, being afraid to prescribe it, patients being afraid to even ask for it. And we see this on a daily basis where people, you know, the rhetoric around that is, we're not there yet. Almost to say as if that unless you're in excruciating pain, you don't deserve opioid analgesics. And we have this paradox also that exists where as recently as even a couple of years ago, and I'm not quite sure what the situation is right now, but in the US, if you went for a tooth extraction, you would be given 3 weeks worth of OxyContin. But what is happening in India is that there are people who are actually asking for, and there are reported cases of this, of their family members to be euthanized because the pain burden is so high, they're in such terrible pain. National Crime Records Bureau statistics said that 1 in 5 suicides in India was in a family where there was a chronic or advanced illness. Now, there could be several reasons for that, but unmitigated pain is definitely one reason, and the financial burden that comes from, you know, inappropriate medical interventions is another. And so while the opioids are available, so to speak, in our country, they're not accessible. And what is the major access barrier is of attitude. And where is this barrier coming from? Is from this dominant narrative emerging from the West. And this opioid crisis that the US is tragically experiencing is another wave of, you know, which has a massive downstream impact on countries like us. Now, I can't not mention the fact that there's also this sort of Western pharmaceutical diktat, right? Where in a country like ours, even though they're covered by the same regulations, a very, very low cost formulation of morphine, which costs less than 5 cents a pill, is not available. But fentanyl patches, which cost 150 times that, are made available. And that's because of, you know, the industrial complex around that. And it's not just about, you know, price differentials, it's also what that translates into human stories. 55 million Indians are pushed below the poverty line annually because of healthcare expenditure. Now, if somebody is in that level of pain and, you know, palliative care is not available and inappropriate, futile interventions are pushed, people do take it. And eventually that leads to, you know, the illness of one person in one generation, resulting in multi-generational loss of opportunity, of debt, children being pulled out of schools, those resources being reallocated for treatment costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we really need now, I think, is to reimagine, and this is very difficult, but we need to reimagine, you know, controlled medicines in a post-colonial framework, and this is what we're all here to talk about, I suppose. But there's a very delicate balance, and like Alejandro said, is there tension or is there convergence? At this point in time, there is opportunity for convergence, but we're nowhere close to it. And unless you have, you know, people people actually living the experience at the table, imagining what those fit for purpose solutions are, I don't think the needle is going to move very far or very quickly. So, I mean, that's what I have to say for the moment, Alejandro.
So let's jump in and push on that last point. You say unless people who actually live the experience are not sitting at the table, it's unlikely that we're going to find convergences and proper regulation. But how about the people who experience it from a different perspective? And I'm thinking about doctors. What is the role here of doctors? Because one of the things that has happened in Mexico over the last few years, and let me throw that at you, to ask you what's happening in India and elsewhere, is that we actually have changed the regulation by us, basically, the formal requests for actually prescribing opioids to make them easier. And so regulation has moved along to make it more accessible. But then we find a very, very deeply entrenched problem is that we don't have doctors who actually know how to use opioids. And of course, that is a result of years of prohibition and stigmatization. And that's something that I think is very important. I want to ask you about that. What role does stigmatization play in making this kind of like a, I'm thinking about the operatives. What role does stigmatization play in what's happening in India, and how does what's happening in the US feed that stigmatization? The idea that it's too lax and too accessible and people fall into a crisis, etc. There's a stigmatization of the use of opioids that inhibits medical professionals from actually learning, not only prescribing, but learning how to use these medicines. So we need to be in a vicious circle in which, you know, regulation keeps people from actually prescribing it, and the fact that people don't prescribe it makes regulation irrelevant once it becomes a little bit more accessible or reasonable.
So thank you for that. I think that's a very, very important question, because it's there are several things that need to come together. There are several moving parts that need to come together in some sort of lockstep, which is very difficult to achieve at the best of times. But when we're living under this narrative, it becomes even more difficult. So we can push for policy and implementation. That's great. We can push for access to essential medicines on a global platform. That's also fine. There has to be demand generation from the end users. But we have a systemic problem where the safe and rational use of opioid analgesics for pain relief till very recently was not even part of the training of physicians to a large extent. I mean, it is there in the textbooks, but they were non-examinable subjects. So, I mean, so it was not prioritized. It's as recent as 2019 that, I mean, now it's, you know, it's a different body, but the then Medical Council of India finally introduced elements of, you know, attitude, ethics, communication, principles of pain relief and end-of-life care. But the problem we're facing now is, and who's going to teach it? Because nobody was taught it. So it's, there are, of course, a huge, I mean, there is a significant percentage of physicians who actually see its value and all of that. But it's a very, very hard sell to the rest of the fraternity. And I cannot tell you how many times I have heard even senior attending physicians just say, no, we're not at a point where you need opioid analgesic, in spite of the fact that the person is in debilitating pain. So we as palliative care organizations and palliative care advocates are still outliers. And, you know, there's a long way to go before we integrate into the system. And this narrative is damning. It is damning. It really, it enhances it. It exacerbates the problem 100 times over. So that is a huge issue. And we are, I mean, one of the major points of advocacy right now is to advocate with the medical fraternity themselves. And this is not just a problem in India, Alejandro. Across Southeast Asian regional countries, the challenge to get it, you know, part of the medical education system has been a very, very uphill task. And who is championing all of these movements are individuals and organizations and NGOs. That's where the push is coming from. So you can imagine it takes its time.
I'm gonna pick up that it takes its time. Also, your metaphor, you know, with many different cogs moving at the same time, and they have to actually match to make things work. And that's a very complex process, and it seems like it's very much an uphill battle when stigma kind of like overshadows the whole phenomenon, right? And here I just want to re-emphasize again the overrepresentation of American problems regarding drug use in the world, in this case, the abuse of prescribing opioids in the US, overshadows and damages the problems that exist elsewhere. And again, just India and Southeast Asia, Latin America also has a serious, I mean, Mexico produces quite a bit of opioids, except we can't produce any legally, for instance. We don't know how to prescribe them, etc. So here, again, I think there's some food for thought about how US dominance affects the rest of the world and how we need to move beyond. Thank you very much, Smriti.
Sorry, I just wanted to ensure that I say
Please.
this, that the opioid crisis in the US and the problems faced in other countries, they're entirely, they're linked, but they're different. I mean, they're different in essence, right? And we have to also make the distinction between prescription drugs and prescribed medicine. So I just want to also mention that, before I go. So thank you very much for your questions.
No, I think that's very important. I hope some questions come up because I want to ask you more on unpacking that difference between prescription and prescribed prescription medicines and prescribed medicines, and I think that's very important. So if nobody else picks it up, I'll bring it up in the question and answer session. Now let me please introduce to you our next panelist. Kojo Koram is a writer and he's also a professor at the Law College, Birkbeck College of the University of London. So I feel a little bit at ease here with a fellow academic sitting here. I would like Kojo to speak about racism. Racism has been something that is very much studied in the United States, the intersection between racism and prohibition. But how about the rest of the world? How well analyzed, how present is the issue of racism in the efforts to move drug policy reform along? Kojo, please, 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and wonderful to be sharing a panel of fantastic speakers. Yes, in terms of the issue of how does the US conversation on racial equality and its relationship with drug policy influence the rest of the world? I think that I have quite a unique perspective in terms of this, not just because of the academic research that I've done, but because my own interest in drug policy reform and its relationship to structural racism actually began in the United States itself. As a wandering law student, I worked for the Capital Post-Conviction Center in Louisiana, which meant that I would spend a lot of time at Angola Prison, largest maximum security prison in the United States for people who are unfamiliar, and a prison which is not only the size of the island of Manhattan in terms of its square feet, but also based on a former slave plantation, which, it's called Angola popularly because the former plantation was called Angola because the slaves that came to that plantation came from Angola in sub-Saharan Africa. And so that kind of institution automatically makes you think about the connection between modern mass incarceration, drug policy, and histories of plantation slavery and racism through the transatlantic slave trade. The book that I was reading, of course, at that time, like I'm sure many of you also were, was Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, which made the connection quite explicitly between the system of racialized mass incarceration driven by drug prohibition in the 21st century and previous systems of structural racism, whether that be Jim Crow segregation, whether that be plantation slavery in previous eras. But of course, when reading that book, I was struck by how, despite its obvious brilliance and incredible influence, it did frame those issues as specifically an American story. The idea of plantation slavery and Jim Crow segregation, the idea of the war on drugs and mass incarceration being an American tale. And reading it, I couldn't help but feel that almost all of the categories that were being wrestled with, whether we think about drugs, whether we think about race, whether we think about law, all of these are essentially global categories. They're not contained within the borders of the United States of America. Drugs is a global commodity. Race, of course, is an issue that was developed across the borders through the colonial process, as some of the earlier speakers of this panel have alluded to. And then coming back to the United Kingdom and looking at how those issues manifest within its own specific history and its own particular socioeconomic problems, you can see how the resonances of what happens in the UK are often lost and ignored when we focus purely upon this quite American tale of racism and drug prohibition. I think one thing that's quite unfamiliar to a lot of my US colleagues, in terms of when we talk about the parochial side of that imperial dynamic, as you mentioned, is the way in which criminal justice and race manifests in somewhere like the United Kingdom, which means, and this was kind of made explicit by the Lamy Review in 2017, that actually as a proportion of the population, of the Black population in the United Kingdom, a higher proportion of them are in prison than the Black population of the US are in prison. So although you have more Black Americans in total currently in prison, you actually have a higher proportion of Black Britons as in relationship to their total population in prison than you do in the United States. And so we can see that the United States is not necessarily the epicenter for all of these dynamics. We can see how in the United Kingdom, stop and search, which of course suspicion of drugs is the primary reason for why stop and searches are executed in the United Kingdom. Black Britons are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white Britons, and so we can see the way in which drug policy reinforces those systems of over-policing and over-incarceration. And of course, over the past few years, we've really focused on the death following contact policing, with the tragic, horrific stories that we've heard in the United States, from Michael Brown to Eric Garner to, of course, George Floyd. And in many of those cases, particularly when we think about the Michael Brown case, because when we think about Trayvon Martin, the role of drugs and narcotics of the actual victim were used quite poisonously, both in the media and in the actual trials, often of the individuals who are acquitted of their deaths. And so we're very familiar with those stories here in the United Kingdom and in many other parts of the world, but I'm not sure there's the same familiarity with stories like the 2017 death of Rashawn Charles in the United Kingdom, another young Black man who was being chased by police on suspicion of drug dealing, who ended up dying due to swallowing the package that he had in his throat, ended up choking on that throat, and found that that package was later found to have only caffeine and paracetamol in it. So it was due to the suspicion of that this poor young man ended up losing his own life. I think the issues that an over focus on the way in which race and drugs might entwine together in the United States, we often focus on those issues as it leads to a certain narrowness of perspective, a certain myopia within American drug policy advocacy or within politics more widely. And we might focus on the way it limits, like you say, that framework within the US discussion. But I also just wanted to kind of start by pointing out how American exceptionalism is actually used by other countries around the world, particularly the United Kingdom. When I think about what I'm familiar with, they like to use that American exceptionalism to actually distance itself from its own racial issues, to make issues such as over-policing, mass incarceration, the way that race and drugs intermingle in that, as something that's a specifically American problem. And we heard this a lot with the Black Lives Matter marches over the last couple of years, the solidarity marches that you see everywhere from France to the United Kingdom to Australia to New Zealand. You'll often find critics of those marches saying, well, these individuals are simply mimicking an American social issue. They're simply trying to parachute America's very specific racial issues into their own jurisdiction. This is something that has been very common in the United Kingdom for a long time. There's always been a real fascination with America's racial politics and often quite a welcoming appetite for American racial justice activists. People could look at the welcoming that James Baldwin received at the Cambridge Union speech back in the 1960s, or the way Muhammad Ali was received on British talk shows like Parkinson. There was a real generosity in hearing their story of racial oppression in the United States, but often as a way to actually distance from what was going on in the United Kingdom. racial justice activists who are making a similar argument in the UK were often, in fact, ignored and not given the same airtime or not given the same generosity of spirit. And so I think the over-focus on race and drugs as an American experiment, which, you know, we can't underestimate the impact that America has had in terms of global drug policy, but it does have a real danger of not only blinding the conversation to the issues that go on in Brazil and Colombia and South Africa and the United Kingdom, but it can also often allow governments and critics within those very countries to try and distance and separate themselves from their own problems around racial justice and around drug prohibition by making it specifically solely an American issue.
So, Kojo, thank you. This is I think, very important. That is, American exceptionalism doesn't only work for the U.S. in the kind of like withdrawing from the responsibility of what happens in the rest of the world, but actually also serves other countries to try to ignore their own issues. And not only do I agree with that, it's something that I think we've lived in Mexico particularly acutely. You know, in Mexico, when I was growing up, throughout, it was all about how racist the U.S. society is, as opposed to Mexican society, in which racism had been supposedly extirpated because we are all mixed race. Right? That's the dominating narrative. In the past few years, so let me put back on this. In the past few years, I think we've become far more aware of our racism in Mexico. But we have had a lot of problems because some of that awareness has actually come from reading and studying and understanding how racism is visibilized in the United States. But when we do that, we import the categories of the U.S. racial imagination, or the U.S. racist imagination, in which the world is divided binarily into, you know, black and white, and that's like core matrix of where the whole imaginary is built in the US. But when you actually look at the racial dynamics in the countries, they're far more complex, at least, I mean, I think they're all complex, but they're imagined as more complex than the US actually can imagine it. So, you know, South Africa imagines its own racial discrimination, its own racial dynamics in a more complex structure in which there are blacks, but there's no colors, and the, you know, white, it's not the same being British, being Afrikaans, etc. In, you know, in Mexico and Latin America, we have both different racial axes for racism. So let me push back on this. What can we do to actually not have U.S. categories for analysis of racism invisibilize the racial dynamics in countries that imagine the racism in complex ways than the binary black and white divide? Is there also colonialism in that black and white divide that's fought against?
I mean, I think that that's a really important point that you're touching on there, Alejandro. It's like there is an element of overfocus an obsession almost, you might say, with the particular way in which racial justice manifests itself in the United States, because the United States has been, for the 20th century, the global hegemon. And so there is also an awareness, I think, within that, if I was going to be more generous about the kind of focus and obsession with racial politics that we might find even in somewhere like, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm very familiar with. I think there's also perhaps a recognition that, well, if the terms and boundaries of racial justice can shift in America, that can open up more space in whichever country and jurisdiction that I'm organizing in. So maybe that's the way that some people are obsessed, can focus on that. But there is a potential, like you say, imperialism in trying to import those categories into other countries that have their own traditions. I think thinking about things in a kind of global continuum is often what I find to be more helpful, because of course each country has their own specifics of the way that issues around race manifest within their own territory. Think about the United Kingdom, for example, has a rich tradition of what people would describe as political blackness. So the idea that everyone from you know, South Asians from Bangladesh to East Africans from Kenya to, you know, Caribbeans from Barbados are all in this category of blackness because of the way that they organize during the 1960s, 1970s, when those early generation of post-World War immigrants arrived and had to collectively organize within cities like London and Liverpool and Manchester and Coventry. This is a category that will be very unfamiliar to an American context, and one that often has to take some unpacking for American colleagues of mine. And that's something that can be critiqued and has been and often should be critiqued, I think, within the United Kingdom. But it is a specific tradition that is the result of the historical and material circumstances of the UK. And you see that as well when you go to, you know, Colombia and Brazil, where there's this plethora of racial categories and categorizations that can be, you know, based on how long it takes to comb, you know, draw a comb through your hair can also determine you to be in a different racial categorization. But the reality is all these different manifestations, all these different categories occurred through a global process. And that's that global process that was, you know, alluded to earlier as colonization. You know, these things didn't occur independently of each other. They occurred in relationship to each other. And whilst they have their own specific, you know, emergences, they are part of this entire global story. I think this is something that really gets forgotten when we think about race, drugs, you know, and politics in terms of America. To even go back to the Mesh Alexander piece, where we go back to the kind of core of American racism, the birth of it, which is, you know, plantation slavery in the Delta South. I mean, significant and specific as often that story can be to America, plantation slavery is not an exclusive American project. You know, in Brazil, in Colombia, in huge parts of the Caribbean, you know, it's to kind of take things in a perhaps more lighthearted way. We often find you know, discussions around the Black British experience as not being able to access the pain or suffering of plantation slavery. You may see that in conversations around, you know, Black British actors and things like that. And, you know, part of me just thinks, well, where do we think that these Black Britons came from? You know, if they came from Jamaica, or they came from Barbados, or they came from, you know, the Bahamas, then they very much did have plantation slavery in their heritage, and that is part of their family story. And their migration from Jamaica, which has been part of the United Kingdom since before the United Kingdom existed. We need to remember that England got a colonial relationship with Jamaica about 30 years before it got a formal union with Scotland to make Great Britain. So it's been part of Britain since before Britain existed. The transition from Jamaica to the mainland of what we call Britain today, I think is very similar to the migration that we see from, you know, the Great Migration as it's described in America, the transition from people from Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana to Detroit and Chicago and New York. These are movements, but that doesn't break the linkage with plantation slavery and with those histories.
Gojo, I think that inadvertently maybe, but you may be making the strongest case for actually staying at the table at the UN, because what you're pointing to are global processes, long arches of history of necessarily global processes that link racism with commodities markets, which are you know, what was produced in the plantation, but is also produced now, or what is put in market through the markets. So I think this is something very complex that we need to reflect about deeply, and that's the global character of prohibition, but also of racism and of colonialism. I'm going to stop there, even though I would love to continue the discussion with a fellow professor, but I will now move on to Vicky Hansen, who's joining us from Jamaica. Now, Vicky, if I were to try to recall all of her experience dealing particularly with cannabis, I would probably stay here and occupy her 15 minutes. So I will limit myself to saying that she is currently research coordinator at the Interdisciplinary Center for Cannabis Research. She occupies and has occupied many other positions, including currently she sits at the board of IDPC. But I want to especially emphasize the following point, because this is where I want to drive at her presentation. She is retail executive at Cannabis Dispensary in Jamaica. So here we're actually bringing it home to one drug that is being reformed, a market that is being opened and regulated, in a country that has already joined that process, and that is medical cannabis in Jamaica. And so what does the perspective look like from there, and how does American exceptionalism and imperialism look from that corner of the world? Please, Vicky, you have the floor for 14 minutes.
Thank you, Alejandro, and also thanks for the organizers for inclusion in this very important discussion. I think I am summing up a number of what the speakers would say earlier. I take note of Kojo's own discussion on our race and culture, and it sums up where we are in terms of medical cannabis in Jamaica. We historically, let's step back, a number of persons would have spoken about the culture of drug use in various stations, in various countries. Jamaica has a culture of cannabis use. But we were, from our colonial masters, they saw this culture of use where our traditional growers and slaves used to use it to help them to work, to help them. They saw it as being rebellious. And so from our colonial British master, criminalized the use of this plant and the communities that use this plant, which are African communities or Indian communities. They saw them as being rebels, and if you looked like me with locks, you were added to that list of persons being discriminated against. That was adopted by our local leaders and taken further into this time period. So we had persons being locked up having records for use and possession of something that persons would grow in their garden and use as traditional medicine. We would have been seen as rebels, as persons, and this came across in terms of our socioeconomic development. Persons who were seen as using cannabis were viewed as the lowest of the society. We were arrested, decriminalized, made to feel less than humans. Fast forward to where we are in terms of a medical cannabis industry, where we now have this regulation. The challenge with this regulation is that it sees medical cannabis as a product, a pharmaceutical type product, where you now have to get prescription, you have to be recommended by a doctor to use this plant that your grandmother would normally use and have in her household to use if you had certain illnesses like asthma or you know, a cold or a cough. So now we are talking about a framework and a model that was adopted from some parts of the US that says our traditional growers who would grow this in their community with the help of community members now have to be registered and given a license that is now costing them X amount of US dollars. Let's say that the cost for license is in US dollars as well. They must now have chain link fence at 8 feet high at least, with camera systems, things that from a community level you would maintain the security by the neighbor watching your cultivation and watching your crop to ensure that it wasn't damaged by animals or thieves. Now you have to have security cameras. For moving cannabis from one point to the next, you had to have a security officer to escort this cannabis, and it has to be paid for. You had to, one, put in track and trace, tracing the plant from seed to sale, as they call it, in an industry that has an informal structure that persons would go and sell in their community shops. So you're looking at something and a model that is taken from a US system. And I must say that when this model was being created, one of the main advisors was a group by the name of Botech Analysis, who came and did their own analysis on how they think that we should regulate something that in our culture and our space was being traded in a manner that was controlled and used by us culturally and traditionally. So and I think Isabel mentioned it earlier, when we are developing regulations, we need to develop these regulations in a way that we're not taking one model from one space, but also looking at what exists in the current situation, in the state that we are in. So what we find in Jamaica is that we are now, within this new drug policy framework, facing another level of colonialism, another level of, this is where our model has to fit into what the US says. So we have moved from one set of colonial masters, from our British masters, who say you can't use this because this will make you rebel against the colonial powers, to our American neighbors who say you have to use this model because this is the model that will make your product acceptable and be seen as working within the international framework. Outside of that, you'll be blacklisted. So these are some of the conversations, Alejandro, that we have to continue and to discuss as how we shape the models that we use in this quote-unquote drug policy framework that we impose on the Caribbean.
So, Vicky, what I hear you saying is the model that is being imported into Jamaica does not fit Jamaica. What you're saying is that
exactly.
traceability excludes Jamaican producers, that having a security
yes,
excludes Jamaican producers. All these are barriers for entering the legal market, which
to the traditional persons who would have built this industry. And so what you're having is that foreign participants are mainly the ones that can afford to. And so there is this, so even though we impose in our regulation, and this is where we implement one thing, we say one thing by the regulation, but implementation is a bit different, where you put in place a model that says, all right, 51% for local, 49% for foreign, but there are backdoor agreements to facilitate them entering the industry.
Okay, so this actually drives the point that I was trying to push you towards, and that is, one interpretation is, well, this is an accident of, the fact that the US is the hegemon, and also the fact that the US began relating markets. We were just, we wanted to legalize in Jamaica. We looked at best practices, we asked around, and we came up with this model that is already working very fine in Colorado, and these are best practices. But there's a different interpretation, because what you're saying is this does not work for Jamaica, this does not fit Jamaica. But it does fit the US market. Now my question is, the model fits US market for homegrown Colorado cannabis. But the fact that it is being exported to Jamaica makes me think that it also fits the US industry for using Jamaica as a producing hub for the US market while excluding local producers.
But the point is, we do not have access to US markets. And this is one of the things that we have to face. You put in place these models, yet still you have this international arrangement that says to you, you can't trade across borders. And then you bring in certain kind of things, because we have what we call our traditional organic standards. Then they're telling you the other barrier to that is that you must meet certain other standards that are European standards, that are American standards, that our traditional standards are not going to meet those, because based on where we sit. So if you, what it is moving the goalpost a little further. So if we should say, all right, traditionally, should we be able to pick up on creating the industry, the traditional growers make their arrangement and try to get in, because a few have gotten in, but there is no trade across border. Our government is at pains of trying to negotiate how do we sell cannabis products outside of the country. We are not having that conversation. You are told there is no international market. So yes, you're setting up this industry in a way to say that the medicinal cannabis framework is what you must meet. However, there now is moving that goalpost to say, oh, these are those type of standards that you need to meet, which for a lot of things, we aren't able to meet those imposed standards. So the organic standards that we would have been noted and using aren't being accepted. And so you have other frameworks. So it is the system that is designed to lock you out in a way that you will not meet it. And it is not in your culture, it's not shaped for you. And so for us, we have been at pains to say, so for example, a case in point, a Rastafarian community is at pains to say that, listen, we need to create this type of model for us, that we have Rastafarian communities across the world that we have been able to negotiate with and have a relationship with. But in each and every country, these are the communities that we have found are being disenfranchised, are being sidelined. And so, Alejandro, the point is, you model and you say one thing in terms of what you want, but I note even the international conventions, I've heard Nazli speaking about it earlier, but the convention also is contradicting its cultural rights convention, because we have a right to culture and to govern our ways so that our culture is accepted. And if you look at the drug conventions, they are inverse to those. We have been blacklisted in Jamaica because we recognize the Rastafarian rights to religiously use cannabis. We have gotten, every drug report has come out to say that that isn't accepted.
So
these
Vicky,
are
let me
issues.
Let me use the last 2 minutes that we have your time to ask you this. What would work? What would a good regulatory system for Jamaica look like? Vicky, are you there? Vicky, I can't hear you well. Okay, we're having a little bit of trouble with Vicky. I think she was disconnected. Let's move on to the question and answers, because we have a limited amount of time. We're already almost up to time, and wait to see if Vicky can connect. Please, Vicky, if you're listening to us, try to connect again. We want to hear that answer, and I will stop the questions and give you the microphone again when you can connect. So if you're there, Vicky? No. There we go. Let's wrap up.
Sorry. What would work for us is one that is a model that recognizes would have been modeled and developed over time in the Caribbean space, in Jamaica.
So what you're saying is we don't have to come up with anything new. Models do work locally, have been functioning locally, and what we need to do is to recognize them and to give them
exactly
space in policy design.
Precisely.
Okay, so I would wrap up with that and move on to questions and say precisely that we don't need to come up with inventing lukewarm water. We already have there, and there's communities that have been working and that have been working well for generations with cannabis, and maybe we should be looking at those models as best practices of regulation. Okay, so we now have a very short time. I'm going to steal a few minutes. We have 6 minutes for questions, and so please write specific questions if they're directed to study in specific in the column here for the chat. But I'm going to start with some of the comments or questions that are here. I'm going to pick them rather arbitrary, so to speak. So let me first open up the floor for specific questions for some of our panelists. So there's one question presented by Colleen Daniels, saying that questioning that we should actually work with the UN in the Office of Drugs and Crime. No other agency in the US actually links an issue, in the UN links an issue with crime. The fact that drugs are discussed as intertwined with crime should be a reason not to act specifically on reform at the UN ODC, but rather at with WHO or UNICEF or UNDP or the sort. So I would like very quickly for Nathalie to take up that question. Maybe we should work multilaterally, but not with UNODC.
Sure. Thanks for that question, Colleen. Yeah, I mean, I certainly take your point that UNODC has posed challenges to the drug policy reform movement and has kind of dragged its feet in ways that other UN agencies have not. Just by way of one example, around the issue of decriminalization, that has been a matter that has been endorsed, supported by a number of UN agencies for many years. And it was not until there was a common position on drugs that the UNODC finally came on board. And the deep irony is that this is the UN agency that is about drugs, but they were virtually the last they were dragged along to endorse decriminalization. So certainly it's an uphill battle in a lot of ways, working with UNODC. For me, that does not equal to ignoring them or negating them, because the reality is that this agency exists. This agency isn't going anywhere. If we are not engaging with them, as I was saying before, the other side of civil society around drugs and drug-free world will be engaging with them. But what I think it does highlight, and I believe another one of your comments articulated this, is just the huge importance of not only trying to intervene with UNODC or the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, but also all the other areas in the UN where drugs comes up, and highlighting those and bringing them together. And you made a comment around the kind of the inherent racism in these treaties, and that made me think of the Human Rights Council resolution that was adopted earlier this year, that was all about the protection and promotion of human rights for Africans and people of African descent, and spoke explicitly about how drug-related policies are leading to these types of outcomes. So for me, something like that can be taken to UNODC and says, you have to focus on this. So across the system is really important.
Nazi, I'll cut you off there. Thank you. And give the word over to Isabel. She wants to speak to this. I'll throw one of the questions that I had for Isabel. If you want, you can consider it or not. But there was a question that why should we treat Coke different from coffee? So please respond to the first question directed at Nazi, but then also, if you want to engage in another one. We have about 2 minutes, and I still have a couple of questions I want to pose. Let's see if we can pull it off.
Great. So very quickly on UNODC, because the national experience on UNODC is very negative. We have the largest UNODC office in the world, and it basically handles Colombian money, but they have no process of accountability, no transparency mechanisms. We have requested FOIAs of information, and they never answer. So they don't see themselves as accountable to Colombian society, and they don't see themselves as having a role in the implementation of human rights or in the implementation of the peace process itself. So I don't have an answer. I just have a concern on whether or not we should continue to engage with an organization such as that. And then on whether or not we should treat coca and coffee the same, hadn't thought of that. My first reaction would be not to repeat the mistakes of coffee itself. For example, one of them is that we have exported our best and finest coffee and never tasted it inside Colombia. So let's try and not repeat those kinds of mistakes and be just a commodity exporter and just a background as producing country.
Good point. That happens in Mexican coffee also. Of course, it's as good as Colombian. There's a couple of questions. I'm just going to articulate them, and then I'm going to close off because we are in time. So I'm going to bring everybody on for closing, and I'm just going to put these questions out there. One was going to be directed to Smirti, and it was articulated by Dr. Claudia Rodriguez, and it was whether medicines, essential medicines, are hoarded for profit, just as we sometimes see happening for vaccines, food, etc. And so, Smirti, if you want to answer that very quickly, do we see a phenomenon of hoarding of that medicine? And then I'll wrap up with the last comment and say thanks.
Coming from the opioids perspective, I'm personally not aware of this, but that's not to discount that it might happen.
Okay, so we're not aware of it, but it happened. And I'm going to wrap up with a comment, and I'm going to leave it open for everyone to reflect on, but we're not going to have time for answers. And there's a comment by Al Stevens, which I think was very important. and that is a shift in the way colonialism is used as a concept. So here we're using colonialism to sort of try to push for a progressive agenda that actually benefits people in different countries. But as he points out, colonialism is now being used by governments as an excuse to reject proposals on drug reform, on gender issues, on environmentalism, etc. So I think we need to take colonialism very seriously, and let's close with that. We need to take colonialism very seriously because we cannot disentrench it from the world prohibition system. We also need to take it carefully so that it's not then used as a double-edged weapon to actually exclude progressive reform. And so I think that we need to take colonialism seriously, and we also need to take parochialism and imperialism seriously in that context, because those are underlying forces to prohibition. I want to thank every one of the panelists. I think it was a great panelist. I've learned a lot from you both preparing for the panel, but also during the panel. This really is a very fresh, I think, take on things. And I want to also thank Cassandra Frederick for having invited me to moderate this panel, and every single one of you who got connected and listened to us. This is what we want, and this is what we need to put these issues on the agenda, on discussion at the global level. And so thank you for listening, because that's we need to speak, but we also need to listen. Thank you all very much for being with us, and have a nice day.